She had once walked with the pride of a matriarch, towering above the grasslands, her ears catching even the softest whispers of her herd. But now she could not move. Her legs were bent in ways no limb should bend, shattered by traps meant to tear flesh and silence footsteps. Flies gathered on the blood-stained soil where she had fallen. She didn't cry out. There was no point. The others had already fled. The poachers had left her behind, not out of mercy, but because they had taken what they came for, and breaking her legs was just a precaution, just in case she tried to follow. Her breathing came in ragged waves, trunk twitching in the dust. She didn't expect to survive. She didn't even know if she wanted to. Until through the thick ache of pain and heat, she felt something familiar. A tiny tug at her side. A calf. Her calf. Still there. Still breathing. Still waiting. And for the first time since the gunshots echoed, she lifted her head. She tried to stand once. Her front legs buckled. She tried again. The pain made her vision blur, but the calf pressed against her side with the insistence only love can muster. Nudging, whining softly, not understanding why she wasn't moving. She couldn't shelter him like before, couldn't nudge him beneath her belly or wrap her trunk around him to guide him away from danger. All she could offer now was presence, and somehow that was enough. Enough to make him stay, enough to make him lie beside her in the dust day after day as the sun scorched their backs and the nights curled around them with cold teeth. Rangers didn't find them for 3 days, and by then her wounds had festered. Maggots had taken root in the open cracks of her legs. But her ears still twitched at every sound her calf made. Her trunk still rose when he stumbled too far. And when the Jeep doors opened and strangers with gloves and metal cages stepped out, she didn't react. Not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. They darted her, and when her eyes closed, the calf screamed. They had to sedate him too, just to get close enough. Transport was rough, hot, jostling, loud. But somehow, they survived. The facility smelled strange, bleach and bark, sterile but not cruel. She woke in a sling, her legs suspended in harnesses, the weight of her own body taken from her. At first she thrashed. Pain and instinct made her blind. But the moment she heard that tiny cry again, that unmistakable squeal, she stopped. He was still there, in the next stall, alive, and just close enough for her trunk to reach through the bars. She found him, and he found her, not in grasslands, not beneath the open sky, but in a quiet stall with no wind and no freedom. Still, they belonged to each other. Weeks passed. Her legs, slowly braced and stitched, began to heal. Not fully, but enough to hold her weight. Her calf learned to feed from a bottle, but always returned to sleep against the stall wall closest to her. They didn't know it then, but the staff had begun calling them the two hearts. Because no matter how broken her body had become, her bond had not fractured. And that, more than medicine, more than steel supports, was what kept her alive. The knowledge that her pain had not stolen everything, that in the silence left by the poacher's cruelty, something still answered when she called. And the calf, wobbly, wide-eyed, growing faster than anyone expected, never strayed far. Not when the gates were opened for exercise, not when keepers tried to coax him into sunlit pastures. He always turned back, always looked for the shape of her through the slats, always returned to sleep beside her scent. His world was still tethered to hers, not by chains, but by choice. And that choice was louder than any shot that had rung out on the day they broke her legs. It echoed in every step he took toward her instead of away. It echoed in every gentle press of his head into her flank. It echoed when she, finally strong enough to stand again, pressed her weight forward, one trembling leg at a time, because he had waited, because he had stayed. And in doing so, he had reminded her that some things, even in the face of violence, do not break. They bend, they scar, they heal, and they remember. She did not return to the wild. Her body could no longer carry the miles, but she found something else in the sanctuary's slow rhythm. In the way the sun warmed the same patch of dirt every morning, in the quiet conversations of the caretakers, in the smell of her calf's breath when he nuzzled her cheek after a nap. She began to greet him with soft rumbles again, her eyes softer, her trunk tracing the shape of his shoulders as if counting what she still had. And he, confident now, taller, bolder, never forgot. He could have left, could have joined the others in the larger herd, could have chased the breeze and tested his legs on hills she would never climb again. But he didn't, not fully, because something sacred had taken root between them in the dust and the blood, in the waiting, something that did not need to be named to be known. It had started in pain, but it had not ended there, because healing didn't always look like running. Sometimes it looked like standing still, side by side, breath sinking not to chase but to remain. She didn't need to walk miles again to find purpose. It waited in the way he leaned against her, no longer out of fear, but out of love. In the way he still curled his body to match hers at night, even though he had outgrown her shadow. In the way the keepers whispered that they had never seen a calf stay this close, this long. It wasn't weakness, it was memory. The kind that lives in the skin, the kind that roots itself in the heart and says, "This is where I was loved," and that, for him, was all the reason he needed to stay. She had given him everything she could. Protection when her own bones screamed, warmth when her body was cooling too fast, presence when absence would have been easier. And now he gave it back, not in words, but in every sunrise they greeted together. In every moment he stood just close enough to brush her side. In every time he turned around to check she was still behind him before crossing the yard. The keepers began to call it the circle, a quiet dance between two lives shaped by cruelty, but not defined by it. A bond that refused to loosen, even when time pressed forward. And when the day came that she could no longer rise on her own, when her legs trembled and gave way again, this time not from pain but from age, it was he who leaned into her side, holding her upright as long as he could. And when she slid down into the earth, head low, breath slowing, he did not run. He stayed, just like she once had. He curled beside her as she had once curled around him. He pressed his forehead to hers, eyes closed. And when her last breath left her body, he did not cry out. He simply stood, quiet, still, remembering, not just the pain, not just the day the world went quiet, but the weight of her trunk across his back when he was too small to walk alone. The hum she made in the stillness of night, when the sanctuary was silent and only their breathing remained. The way her eyes followed him, even when she was too weak to move. These were not just moments, they were anchors, quiet proofs that love, once given freely, never truly vanishes. It shifts, it settles, it becomes something we carry. He did not leave her side that day, not when the sun dipped low, not when the caretakers whispered and waited from a distance. He stayed long after the last breath, long after her body had cooled. He watched the wind play with the dust on her skin. He listened for a sound he knew wouldn't come, but still, he listened, because some part of him believed she might speak again. That love, even in its silence, could still echo. And when they finally coaxed him away, he didn't resist, but he kept turning back, not in panic, not in confusion, but as if marking a path, one he could walk again in memory. The other elephants welcomed him, slowly, gently, but he never quite let them in the same way, because he had already known the kind of love that doesn't end, that doesn't ask to be returned, that simply remains. And in the years that followed, when he grew taller than any of them, when his stride became stronger, his body fuller, there was still a softness to him, a stillness. He didn't fight, he didn't challenge. He stood beside the ones who needed him most. He leaned into the frail, walked with the old, waited for the unsure, because that was what she had done and what he had learned, that presence is sometimes the only thing that saves us. And that even when nothing else can be fixed, being there, truly being there, is enough. Not because it changes what happened, but because it honors it. Every step he took after her passing wasn't about forgetting, it was about caring, quietly, without spectacle, without demand. The sanctuary staff often found him standing at the edge of her resting place, not crying out, not searching, just standing, as if in silent communion with something deeper than grief, as if the soil still held her heartbeat and the wind remembered her name. And in that silence, something extraordinary began to happen. Other calves, orphaned or frightened, started to follow him. Not out of dominance, but out of instinct. They gravitated toward his calm, his steadiness, the unspoken comfort in his gaze. He would stand beside them, sometimes for hours, never forcing, never leaving. He became their still point, their reassurance that pain didn't mean abandonment, that loss didn't mean the end. The keepers noticed how he always paused before taking his food, waiting to see if the smallest among them had eaten. How he shielded the weakest from sudden noise. How he would gently nudge the old or injured forward when they hesitated. He had taken the love she gave him and made it a legacy, not loud, not proclaimed, but lived, in his presence, in his patience, in the way he moved through the world with a quiet kind of strength that never needed to be proven. And sometimes when the dusk light fell just right, when the air held the same hush as it did the day she died, he would lift his head and stare across the plains, not looking for her, but remembering. And in that remembering, she lived again, not in form, but in function, not as a memory, but as a rhythm, the rhythm of a life that had taught him how to stay, how to love, how to lead, not with dominance or noise, but with steadiness, with the kind of presence that calms storms before they start. The younger ones didn't need direction. They needed reassurance, and somehow he gave it, in the way he slowed his pace when someone struggled, in the way he placed his body between danger and fear. He wasn't the biggest, wasn't the boldest, but he was the one they trusted to stay. Years passed. His coat thickened with dust and time. The sanctuary changed. New paths, new rangers, new calves. But some things didn't change. The path he walked each morning, passing the tree where she once stood waiting. The pause he took before drinking, as if offering the first drop to memory. The low hum he sometimes let out at night, not calling, not mourning, but remembering. A melody only he knew, a lullaby from another life. And it wasn't just the elephants who noticed. The caretakers began bringing new orphans to him directly, calves who had lost mothers in storms, to poachers, to illness. And every time without fail he stood beside them, let them tremble against his side, let them cry without shame, let them sleep beneath the shelter of his silence, because he knew no medicine could replace what presence could restore. And though he never spoke, never told his story, it lived in the way others walked beside him, in the softened footsteps, in the shared gazes, in the nights no longer filled with panic, but with peace. What she had once given him, he gave again and again, not as duty, but as devotion, as a way of keeping her close, of turning pain into legacy, of becoming what she had always seen in him, before he could see it in himself, before he understood that what she left behind wasn't just memory, it was direction, and that every time he stood still so another could feel safe, every time he waited just a little longer so no one felt left behind, every time he closed his eyes and breathed through the ache, he wasn't just remembering her, he was becoming her echo. And that echo moved through the herd like wind through dry grass, soft, constant, and impossible to stop. It reshaped how they stood together, how they circled the weak, how they mourned not with collapse but with solidarity. Because love, once planted, doesn't stay buried. It grows, it spreads. And in his stillness, they found movement. In his quiet, they heard the loudest truth. Healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums low, beneath the ribs, beneath the pain, until one day you realize you're no longer carrying the past. You're walking with it. And he did, every morning, past the tree, past the stone that marked where she had lain, past the calves who now ran instead of trembled. His steps were slower now, but each one carried more than just his weight. It carried her strength, her love, her decision to stay. Because in that final moment, when she could have closed her eyes and let go completely, she didn't. She stayed. And because she stayed, so did he. So did they all. Not because they were told to, not because they had to, but because something ancient had taken root again, something older than fear and louder than loss, a rhythm, a remembering, a reason. They began to walk with more awareness, pausing for one another, learning the silent language of presence. When one calf hesitated at the river's edge, they didn't nudge him forward. They waited, just like he once had been waited for. When an elder faltered under the weight of age, the circle tightened, not to mourn, but to hold. They had seen what staying could do, what it meant, how it healed, and though none of them spoke the words aloud, they carried them anyway, in how they touched trunks, in how they circled the fallen, in how they returned again and again to the places where sorrow had once lived and turned them into sanctuaries. Not because they'd forgotten what happened there, but because they remembered. And memory, when carried in love, becomes legacy. Not just a story whispered at dusk, but a way of being. A path walked by many, but paved by one. And that one, whose legs were once shattered, whose world was once fire and steel and silence, had become a guidepost. Not because she asked to be, but because she dared to keep going. Even when no one thought she would. Even when the world offered every reason to give up. She gave something else instead, herself, not as a symbol, not as a sacrifice, but as a quiet, steady truth, one that didn't ask for recognition, only to be carried forward. In the shuffle of hooves across the dry earth, in the hush that settled over the herd when the sun dipped low, in the space they always left open beside the calves, just wide enough for her memory to slip in. Because what she gave was not just survival, it was permission. To feel, to grieve, to go on. And they did, not by forgetting, but by remembering differently, gently, with grace. They didn't move on, they moved with her steps still echoing in the ground, with her strength woven into the way they stood, with her presence held not in shadow, but in shape, in habit, in love. It's not loud what she left behind. It doesn't shout, it doesn't shine, but it stays. In the way a young bull pauses before drinking, glancing toward the place she once stood. In the way an older matriarch closes her eyes longer than needed, as if listening. In the way they all shift slightly when the wind picks up, forming a shape that's no longer incomplete, because she may have gone, but what she stood for never left. It lingered in the dust she once kicked up with uncertain steps. In the hush that fell over the valley at dusk, when even the birds grew quiet, as if remembering her shape against the dying light. It pulsed in the bones of those who had watched her rise when no one believed she would. It was in the way the youngest calves leaned into their mothers at night, pressing close as if drawn by something older than instinct, something she had taught them without words. And sometimes when the rains came soft and steady, and the river swelled with the sound of life returning, they would gather where she had once fallen. No ceremony, no noise, just presence, just trunks touching trunks in the silence, just eyes closing as if to say, we remember. Not just her pain, but her choice, to keep going, to trust again, to stand, not just for herself, but for those who would come after, for those who needed proof that healing was possible, that strength was not the absence of pain, but the willingness to carry it forward with grace. That love, once given, can shape more than a moment. It can shape generations. And though her body no longer moved among them, her story did. In the way they stepped around the fallen, in the way they waited for the slowest to catch up, in the way they made space, not just for survival, but for memory, not as a burden, but as a gift, a quiet inheritance from one who had once been broken and never let it define her, only deepen her, into something the herd didn't just follow, but leaned into, as if her pain had carved out a space they didn't know they needed until they stepped inside it. It didn't weaken her memory, it made it sacred, because what had once nearly destroyed her had instead become a place of shelter for others, a quiet clearing in the middle of a loud, violent world, where grief could rest without shame and strength didn't have to roar to be real. And as the seasons changed and the herd grew, and new calves found their footing, her story shifted too. It wasn't just a memory of what had happened. It became a lesson in what could be, in what still lived on when everything else was stripped away. Not triumph, not even healing, but continuity, a bond that refused to break, even in absence, even in silence. She had given them more than survival. She had given them a way to live with what they couldn't undo, to hold space for both love and loss in the same breath, to know that every scar carried something worth remembering, and every step forward could still carry the weight of what came before, without collapsing under it. That was her legacy, not what she endured, but how she turned it into something they could all walk with, together, always. And when the oldest elephants gathered at dusk, those who had walked the furthest, carried the most, remembered the deepest, they didn't speak of her suffering. They spoke of her stillness, her choice to stay, her refusal to vanish. And when the rains came and softened the earth, and a young calf tripped in the mud, it was her story they whispered as they helped her rise. Not with urgency, not with force, but with patience born of something ancient and tender and true. Because the ground remembered her. The roots knew her name, and the path the herd walked now, gentler, slower, wider, was one she had shaped with every shattered step she once took alone. She was not a monument. She was emotion, and every heartbeat that continued after hers was not just a tribute, but a continuation of love, of resilience, of the truth that what breaks us can also deepen us. If this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere, someone needs to remember that even in the darkest pain, there is a path forward, and it might begin with the quiet presence of one who refused to disappear.